Many of us have a SpLD. 10% of us have dyslexia. It is 2020. Equality is on the rise, as well as businesses which need as many unique assets as possible. Why then is the unemployment level high for people with SpLDs?
I design things for the web, and most of how that affects me is that I have to make sure the things I make are accessible to people who have visual impairments and other kinds of impairments. Do you know what I mean? But for me personally, I think you should design for accessibility first. Yeah, not as a kind of a sideshow. I think if the work you're making isn't accessible, then I'll just be honest, I think you failed. I think you have to design for accessibility right at the foundation. If you haven't done that, then you've just wasted your time. Design for accessibility first. Accessibility first. First.
Well, I think people with learning difficulties, the only way they improve and not just kind of stay at the same level is if they have teachers who completely understand what is needed to do in order for them to develop. And there are known strategies out there, so it's just a matter of having teachers that know and understand what needs to be done. And I think a crucial issue as well, especially in schools, is that people with learning difficulties need very, very, very quiet environments.
So we are campaigning in a few areas, but particularly to get more support available in schools by having a specialist dyslexia teacher assessor, and that would mean that every school had someone available that if a classroom teacher spotted signs that someone might be dyslexic, could run a diagnostic assessment and then could put in appropriate support strategies. At the moment, provision is fairly poor in schools, and that's because it's very underfunded. Schools are required to find the first £6,000 of funding from their general budgets, and with budgets very constrained, that means that often they're not in a position to offer the support that legislation gives people.
We have lots of teaching assistants in schools, but they do not have the correct training.
A lot of schools are very paper-based. They don't use technology very much, but actually, when young people enter the workplace, they have a lot of technology available to them. And it's logical for everyone to have access to technology during school so that they're prepared for work, but particularly for pupils with dyslexia.
Went to a mainstream primary school, and at the age of 9 he was still having difficulty reading words with 3 CVC syllables, and he was having to sound them out. At the age of 9, his reading age was 5. In order to help Oliver access the curriculum and to help him accelerate his reading age to what it should be, we had no choice but to find a school which had much smaller class sizes and had intervention teachers who were following interventions which were proven to work. One of the things that Hume Hall does is it acknowledges that people, children and people in general, learn in a variety of ways, and they had a multi-sensory learning system in place that meant that the curriculum was more accessible to a wider number of children. Throughout their lives, not being encouraged, and their abilities have not been manifested at school, so they probably lack the confidence to feel that they can hold down a fully paid job as well as anybody.
Be an inhibitor to someone accessing the kind of job that they want, and in the right environment, particularly somewhere that those dyslexic strengths can be an advantage. People can do incredibly well at work. 40% of the UK self-made millionaires are dyslexic, especially in things like some of the creative sectors. We see very high numbers of people with dyslexia and doing incredibly well. But then we often sadly hear of workplaces where people don't do well because of their dyslexia, and there's no reason for that to be the case. It's just a case of organizations getting better at understanding what an employee with dyslexia needs, and actually as we understand neurodiversity better, we're seeing that organizations, and we're knowing that organizations that have high levels of neurodiversity are better problem solvers than organizations that don't. Dyslexics seem to have very good strengths in dealing with broader, more complex, more nuanced information. Dyslexics seem to have a definite advantage when it comes to seeing things in the big picture. There's also a lot of evidence that people with dyslexia are strong on visual spatial working. Then often, people talk now about how dyslexia brings creative strengths, and creativity is a really, difficult one to define because it's so broad, and it's certainly not a case that people that are dyslexic are creative and people that aren't dyslexic aren't. That's obviously not the case. But from what we can see from the kind of research and our work and understanding of dyslexia is that big picture thinking, that constant want to challenge and find new ways of doing things, and that strength in working in 3D often means that people in creative roles often people with dyslexia in creative roles do really well. People with dyslexia have what are commonly called spiky profiles, so they'll be very good in some areas but quite weak in other areas. They don't, they're often not, sort of all-rounders. If you put a job description out there that's asking for someone that can be very creative but also be very organized and do all this massive list of things, often someone that's dyslexic will go, well, I'm really, really good at some of those things, but also I'm really bad at some other things. When you fill in the job application, there's normally a box that says, do you have a disability? But actually most people that are dyslexic wouldn't consider themselves disabled, so might not tick that box. So maybe add a box that says, do you have a neurodifference, or do you consider yourself neurodiverse, and list dyslexia as an example of that, along with things like autism. And then if someone does tick that box, have a conversation with them and go, what accommodations would be helpful for you, because every person with dyslexia is different. Often we hear of people with dyslexia being put off a job that has sort of a psychometric testing element. It's you can often end up in a situation where you assume that because someone's dyslexic, they will benefit from X and Y and Z, tools that are commonly used by people with dyslexia to support their work, but actually, that's not always necessarily the case. There is, obviously employers, because of the Equality Act, have a legal obligation to make reasonable adjustments for an employee with dyslexia, the same with any SpLD or any disability. There isn't, a list at the moment of SpLD friendly employers. There's certainly some employers who have done really good work and have been very public about that. So, if you look online, we run a scheme called Smart Award, which is looking at organisations that are dyslexia friendly. So the members of that would be a good place to look at because they're going to have good systems in place. There are some specialist recruitment agencies. I think it's called Exceptional Individuals is the one that we've worked with in the past.